Welcome to CNN Talk. We're discussing morality in relation to the British race to become Conservative leader, but it also plays into a much wider debate. Always comes up in elections, morality. And why are we talking about it today in the UK?
We're talking about it today because on Saturday it was revealed that Michael Gove, who's the current Environment Secretary, has admitted to taking cocaine on several occasions in the past. Now, this is 20 years ago. And normally in these circumstances, a politician will put it down to a youthful indiscretion. But it turns out that Michael Gove was over 30. So you can't really use that argument. It also then turned out that the day after he held one of these, to quote the tabloids, drug-fueled parties in his flat, of course, nobody knows quite the truth of that, he wrote an article in the Times, literally the day after, denouncing anyone who took hard drugs. So he's not only facing charges of having taken a Class A illegal drug, it's the hypocrisy charge that bizarrely, for some people, is actually more difficult to contend with than the taking of the drugs. Now, you can look at this in two ways. You can think, well, it's a terrible thing. He committed an illegal offence. He could have got 7 years in prison for taking cocaine. And you can say, well, it was 20 years ago. Why should that have any bearing on his ability to do the job now? Or you could say, well, he's committed an illegal offence. Sorry, that's the same argument, isn't it? The second argument is, well, it's just something that belongs in the past. Everybody deserves a second chance. We judge him on his record since he's been in Parliament, which you have to say he's been one of the most impressive Conservative front bench. Whether you agree with what he's done, whether you agree with his policies or not, he is one of the big beasts of the political jungle.
Do you think this is the tabloids just obsessed with it, or do you think the nation's obsessed with it as well?
I don't think it's just the tabloids. And I think the obsession isn't necessarily a judgment call on what people have been doing. So I don't think it's necessarily so much the idea of people having taken drugs in their past and before they entered public life. I think it's more a question of hypocrisy and double standards. So the thing that seems to rankle in terms of public perception is the idea that there's one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. And especially when, you know, as Ian said, they are castigating the everyone else and saying that the government should be punitive about everyone else, but must in some way think themselves to be separate from that, or they wouldn't be writing about it while taking drugs. And I think it's that double standard and the idea of being above the law in some way that has rankled and perpetuated this story.
A lot of people have said, you know, from the establishment, dare I say, saying they weren't shocked by this news. But doesn't that just play to the issue many people have with the political establishment, that there's one rule for them, as Rachel's saying, and the wider public actually feel that he should be punished for it?
I think the way we approach this particular issue of drug taking is in flux. I think some politicians, if they hadn't smoked a joint at university, they'd seem a bit square. I think if you do that kind of thing, particularly a Class A drug like cocaine rather than a Class B drug like cannabis, though some forms of cannabis are stronger these days than they should be Class A in my view. If you do it when you're a lawmaker, so you're an MP or a minister, then it's absolute, you're out, back to the dugout. You're not coming back on the field of play. If you do it when you're a university student, as Ian said, it can be dismissed as youthful indiscretion. When Michael Gove wrote that column in the Times, it was before he became an MP in 2005. But in some ways, he was in public life by then. He was one of the principal opinion formers of this country in a broadsheet newspaper. And he was probing specifically this issue, calling people out for something that he was in fact doing at the time. And that suggests to some people, yeah, this is just like a power trip for him. That's quite strong.
But it was before he was a politician.
It was before he's a politician, but to use the platform of a national newspaper column to berate others for doing something that you'd done, you know, the night before,
just
perhaps.
To correct you, it was way before 2005.
No, sure, it was way before.
It was at the end of 1990s.
I've looked up the dates too. Right. But it's before he was an MP, so he wasn't a lawmaker. But in the late 90s, Michael Gove was a very powerful journalist. And in some ways, he was in public life at that point.
The issue of Coming up in the leadership race here in the UK for the ruling Conservative Party. Morality coming up very regularly in politics, as you know. Do voters really care about a candidate's moral compass, though?
As if Brexit wasn't controversial enough, now scandal is hitting the race to replace Theresa May as British Prime Minister.
And Michael Gove also now being branded as a hypocrite. This after he admitted to using illegal drugs decades ago.
Yes, it was a crime. It was a mistake. I deeply regret it.
More than half have admitted to past drug use, from cannabis to cocaine to opium.
I think I am a great moral leader.
The moral vandalism is coming from this White House.
Just 1 month before Election Day, this video surfaced.
When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
If we're going to start making moral judgments about everybody in public office, we'll have nobody in public office.
Have your say. Go to facebook.com/CNN International. Heidi says Gove is a total hypocrite. Elizabeth says Trump's election shows that voters don't actually care about a candidate's moral compass. Ian, if I could begin with you, just take us through the issue with Gove, what he's admitted and why we're still talking about it.
Michael Gove is one of the most eloquent politicians that there are in the country today. He's a very controversial character. He started off as a journalist with The Times. I remember back in 2003, just after I'd been selected as a Conservative candidate for the 2005 election, I was on a panel with Michael at the Conservative conference, and it was all about the future of politics. And I remember he spoke very eloquently about sort of the why people should get into politics. And I said, well, hang on a minute. You're standing there as a journalist. Put your money where your mouth is. Why don't you stand? And he says, because I couldn't afford it. 3 months later, he was selected for the safe seat of Surrey Heath. And he's had a stellar career in many ways. He stood for the leadership last time. He knifed Boris Johnson, the favourite at the time. He didn't succeed. He spent a year out of government. Then Theresa May brought him back, and he's held as Environment Secretary. He's been Justice Secretary, Education Secretary and Chief Whip. So he's got a lot of experience. However, this scandal broke over the weekend where it was actually as a result of a biography of him written by a young journalist called Owen Bennett, a biography that I commissioned when I was back publishing, so it's all my fault, basically. And Owen had found out that he had taken cocaine, and credit to Michael Gove, there was no caveating. He immediately came out and said, yes, this is right, I did it, and I regret it. But normally in those circumstances, the politician says, well, it was a youthful indiscretion. He said, well, it was 20 years ago. Well, Michael Gove is 52, so work out the math. So he was over 30. Most of us at the age of 30, we kind of know what we're doing. If we do something that's illegal, we're probably aware of what the possible consequences are. And he was sharing a flat with another future Tory MP, Nick Bowles, and also a very colourful character called Ivan Massow. And their parties were held. Apparently, cocaine was present at these parties. No one can actually prove how often Michael Gove took it, but I was not invited to any of these parties. I didn't know any of the characters at that time. I wish to place on the record. I am very conservative when it comes to drugs, in that I've never taken one, partly because I fear that if I did, I might quite like it and therefore would want to do it again. Now, he says that he took cocaine on several occasions. Well, that word several can cover a multitude of sins. It could mean
2
3.
or 50, yeah.
It could mean 50. Now, he says it didn't become a habit. Clearly, there's no evidence that he's taken it since. If there was, I think he would be finished. So the question now that the media has to contend with, Conservative MPs have to contend with, and in future, probably Conservative Party members who will have a vote, does this matter? And I think that, as what Rudy Giuliani said in that film there, in the end, the public are a lot more forgiving of these things than the media sometimes is. I mean, this is a great media story. Yeah. It is. And the very people who are being so highly critical of Michael Gove are probably the people that attended those very same parties who've done it themselves.
But I wonder about that because, you know, you don't have the same criticism about cannabis, and cocaine is seen as a very expensive elitist drug. Isn't that part of the issue here?
I do think that's a part of the issue. Yes, it's that association with, you know, wealth. it's the wealthy drug, you know, it's the city, you know, the bankers and the financiers, it's the London metropolitan drug of choice. That's the perception. That's why I think that explains part of the reason why there is judgment over it. The other thing is, of course, that it is a Class A drug. And I think that one of the things about this issue of hypocrisy does feature quite highly, because it's not as though Gove has even used this opportunity to say, actually, yes, that was a mistake, but also, you know, my hard-line punitive approach to drug use was a mistake, and we need to look at issues like care. You know, we need to think about categorizing things like Class A drugs with all the addiction that there is, even among, you know, even with a drug that has this perception of being a middle class, you know, a rich person's pursuit. There is a rate of addiction with it, and there is a fallout from it. And to place that in the category of healthcare, as opposed to just straightforward criminality, I think there was a moral opportunity there that was missed.
But also the other moral issue here is he wrote this column, didn't he, at the time?
It does matter that it's a Class A drug, both legally and symbolically, given that it's cocaine. Cocaine, of course, leaves a trail of human destruction, not just for the user and their families, but all the child enslavement and gangland warfare and so on. Had he taken a Class A drug or even cannabis while an MP, let alone the senior minister, then it would be complete curtains. He'd be toast.
He was a journalist.
He wasn't an MP. He was a journalist. So you think, well... But it wasn't a youthful indiscretion, as Ian rightly said. He was a proper formed adult in his 30s. This wasn't just behind the bike sheds at university or something. And then he wrote this column at the very time he was engaging in this, maybe not a habit, but certainly something he did more than once. And the column was designed to reprimand people who were doing precisely what he was doing at the time. So in some sense, you know, I remember Michael Gove well from that period and you know, he was a very senior journalist. He was a prominent, one of the most prominent commentators on one of the most respected newspapers in the world, and he was basically hoodwinking his audience for kicks. I mean, that really, you know, I admire Michael Gove in many ways, and he was is a very, very effective politician and minister who grabbed hold of tough issues and did things not to be popular because he thought they were right, and I think that's good. But I think that the display of character to write a column that you know is hypocritical, that's quite shocking to me.
Let's just hear from him first, because he spoke to Andrew Marr. We should hear from his point of view.
Yes, it was a crime. It was a mistake. I deeply regret it.
Should you have gone to prison?
Well, I was fortunate in that I didn't, but I do think that it was a profound mistake, and I've seen the damage that drugs do. I've seen it close up, and I've also seen it in the work that I've done as a politician, and that's why I deeply regret the mistake that I made.
How many times did you take cocaine?
I took it several occasions, on social occasions, more than 20 years ago when I was working as a journalist.
Was it a habit?
No, I don't believe it was.
We were all waiting for that interview, weren't we? What did you think when it went out?
Well, it's interesting because if I'd been asking the questions, I'd have led off with it. But it was right at the end of the interview that he was asked about it. I thought Gove, he had a shaky bit in that interview, but most of it, actually, I thought he did quite well in. One other aspect, though, let's just remember Michael Gove's background. He was adopted. He comes from Aberdeen. He wasn't born into the sort of silver spoon in mouth classes. He did go to Oxford. But I suspect, and I can relate to this, Liam, I suspect you can too,
I absolutely
that
agree.
there was an element of wanting to fit in with the kind of people that he was mixing with at the time. And sometimes you do get led astray into doing things that you probably know are wrong. I'm not saying this happened with him, but I can imagine it was part of it. He didn't come from sort of Notting Hill in West London. He didn't come from Oxford. He got into those social circles. And we all know that drugs are rife in those social circles. Even on The Times, I mean, one or two of his journalist colleagues at the time, one in particular, who he was very keen to, I suspect, cultivate, was a well-known cokehead. And you may say, well, that indicates a weakness of character. But when you come from outside
Nowhere.
these circles, it is quite... And I remember, I probably wasn't until I was 50 years old, so like 6 years ago, that I actually felt totally comfortable in these circles myself, where I didn't regard myself as a social inferior to these people.
Yeah.
When I would be in a social setting with David Cameron, George Osborne, people like that, there was always this inner confidence that they exuded. Whereas if you come from a comprehensive school background, you kind of feel a bit of an imposter. Now, I no longer feel like that, but I did until comparatively recently.
Rachel, we should point out, shouldn't we, that other candidates have admitted taking drugs as well, but all the papers going for Gove on this. You can see it on all the front pages, but I wondered what you thought of this, which is a London, a metropolitan newspaper. Some people pointing out, you know, form a line here, Tories go nose to nose. Should we be laughing about it, though? I mean, it's witty, isn't it? But is this part of the problem that we think it's funny?
I mean, look, the puns sort of write themselves, don't they, with this story, and they have been for the last few days. And there is a funny element of it, of course, but we also do know that, you know, these Class A drugs are extremely addictive, and the fallout from using them for users, their family, and as Liam was saying, the trail that leads to their production and supply is grim. It's a grim one, and that is a serious issue. But I think there's another issue here that we haven't really looked at when we're widening it out to other candidates that have taken or admitted to whichever recreational drug they've taken in the past. You know, Boris has also admitted to using cocaine, and there's something...
No,
he has.
He joked.
Other drugs.
He joked about
He
it.
said it.
He admitted it to Marie Claire magazine in 2005.
He didn't admit that he used it.
He said
he
had been given it.
He'd been given it, and there was, I can't remember the exact words, but he didn't actually inhale it.
It reminded me of the Clinton "I didn't inhale" thing. It was a kind of a non-denial denial.
Okay, let's widen this point out then, because rather than the specifics of when he did what, there is, if we're talking about morality, there is a problem here with applying different standards of morality to different candidates. So Boris Johnson is not somebody who you think is particularly a morally righteous character. You know, he has had many problems around issues of morality. He has been admitted to lying to a former employee.
Former party leader.
A former party leader. He has had various questionable moral judgments around things that he said about different people from different ethnic minorities. There are issues around the way that he's treated his former partners.
People?
No, but my point is to apply standards consistently.
Well,
so there's something about the attacks on Gove that smack a little bit of factional campaigning.
I agree with that
and
to an
letting
extent.
Boris get a free pass for things that are just as morally questionable.
I do think if we look back in our history in this country, if we judged people by the moral standards of today, we would not have had Lloyd George as Prime Minister.
Churchill.
We would not have had Churchill as Prime Minister, and there are probably quite a few others too.
And our American...
We can't have people who are perfect specimens.
It's not about the morality, it's about the double standards, and that's the bit where it hits Conservative candidates, because they claim to be about one thing, socially conservative, usually, and then they end up being another, and that's the problem. It's the hypocrisy.
Well, there's
not
hypocrisy
the morality.
across politics, isn't there? I mean,
Yes, there is,
many politicians
absolutely.
on the left claim to be for the people, and then they're dodging taxes and buying loads of houses, using offshore vehicles. And we can mention people in Parliament today on the shadow front bench that are doing those things. Just to broaden it out a bit, I just have to say that Ian's point about the whole imposter syndrome thing is very well and sensitively made, and there may have been something in that from a, you know, still a comparatively young man from Aberdeen hanging around with...
It's not an excuse. It's
it contextualises a decision, decision he made, and it may be part of the reason why he made that decision. But, of course, we don't want perfect human beings, because then we would end up with anodyne policy making and people who have no bearing in the real world. Don't go out and take drugs to prove your street cred, but I don't think somebody should be deliberately excluded from politics.
Should be taken into account.
If they did something, an indiscretion. I mean, you know, Churchill was a deeply imperfect human being. John F. Kennedy was a deeply imperfect human being. François Mitterrand had a whole family on the side that no one talked about. And these are, arguably, some of the great leaders of the 20th century.
Everything comes from character, says Kim. If you don't have it, I don't want you making decisions that will affect my life.
That's very unfair. Let me give you another example. When I was 14, I was convicted of shoplifting, and I was a serial shoplifter, and I knew what I was doing was wrong. I've got no excuse about youthful indiscretions. I knew it. I suppose it gave me a kick. Now, should that exclude me from being on this programme? Should that exclude me from running for Parliament?
But you
should
were 14.
That exclude me?
You were a kid.
No, I
age
accept
issue,
that.
isn't
But
it?
that what you just read out there would exclude anybody who'd ever committed any kind of offence at any point in their life.
There is a point here that we're not looking at to do with Conservative candidates, which is around, you know, there's a Trumpian quality to the Conservatives. They have been taken over by a very hardline right wing that is very similar to Trump in its capacity to take things in a particular direction and to persuade people that these immoralities and indiscretions are priced in. You know, the lying, the lack of attention to detail, the lack of policy knowledge, the insuitability of candidates who are nevertheless given power. That is a very Trumpian trend, and you can see it in the way that
What you've just said is actually very Trumpian.
a lot of Conservative MPs who should know better are going to fall into line and back Boris Johnson because they want to be on the train rather than under it, and that is very similar to the way the Republicans acquiesced and conceded to Trump.
We'll be hearing from Donald Trump after the break. We're back in a moment. Because, I mean, there's the drug issue, which is a legal issue and a moral issue, but then you can talk about, you know, affairs and, you know, misogyny, which aren't illegal. I mean, are we talking about the same thing here, though?
No, we're not talking about the same thing. We are talking about the same thing, though, if the politician involved, when asked the proper question, lies point blank, publicly or even privately to their spouse or to a party leader. And Rachel's right. Boris had his comeuppance when he lied about an affair to Michael Howard, the party leader at the time, back in the mid-2000s. And he was rightly sacked, even though the Tories knew at the time he was electorally an asset for them. And this is where I would take issue with my friend Rachel is that I don't think this is just a Republican and a Conservative thing. It's right across all the political parties, hypocrisy and immorality, and with Clinton as well. But it comes back to the notion of, should people be given a second chance? Yes, I think they should, particularly when it's youthful. But that's the thing about this column that Michael Gove wrote. He wasn't in his youth. He was a fully formed adult when he took cocaine repeatedly by his own admission, and then he wrote a column telling other people that they shouldn't do that. That seems to me rather narcissistic.
And hypocritical.
We're talking about the British Conservative Party election race. Michael Gove admitting that he took cocaine. It's a big story here in the UK, and questioning the morality around that. Rachel was talking about Donald Trump earlier. During the break, we were talking about Bill Clinton. Let's go back to Bill Clinton's famous moment where he apologised on TV.
I don't think there is a fancy way to say that I have sinned. It is important to me that everybody who has been hurt know that the sorrow I feel is genuine. First and most important, my family. Also, my friends, my staff, my cabinet, Monica Lewinsky and her family, and the American people.
How does that play into the current debate, do you think, in British politics, then? Is it?
Bill Clinton is a man who just exudes charisma. When you're in the same room as him, even before he was American president, which I was on one occasion, he just fills the room with his personality. And his party gave him all kinds of free passes with all kinds of transgressions and all kinds of sins. And arguably his family and his closest family did as well, partly because he is, you know, electoral Viagra in some ways. And I'm not saying Boris has this charisma at the same level, but he certainly has it to some degree, and potentially he has it. The UK is in a very precarious situation at the moment. No one quite knows what's going to happen. The idea of consensus is being overtaken by the idea of leadership. And maybe Boris is the kind of person who can lead the country. And it's frustrating for the left and it's frustrating for people in the Conservative Party who don't like him. But increasingly, swing voters are coming around to that point of view. So I think people do get more forgiveness if they have this kind of electoral power. Gove has that to some degree. He's a very iconoclastic figure, not as charismatic as Boris, but not far behind. And that's the dilemma that Tory MPs and then the Tory party have to wrestle with as they decide who's going to take Britain into the next stage of its history.
These are the latest odds, Ian. Boris obviously way out in front. Michael Gove up there as well. Do you think this is what we're going to end up by the end of the day? Because it's going to be whittled down, isn't it, the ultimate list?
Yeah, there are 11 contenders at the moment, and the Conservative MPs have to whittle them down to 2 over the next 10 days or so. And Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, they are seen as the favourites. Jeremy Hunt, I would say, is the 3rd favourite, and all of the others are really vying to get to the top 2. You've got Penny Mordaunt on there. She's actually just declared for Jeremy Hunt within the last few minutes. And I thought she could have been the dark horse that came through the middle. But she's pitching herself for next time now. But look, there's a long way to go. We know from previous contests that the front runner very rarely comes through. And Boris Johnson isn't taking any risks here. He's doing very little media, very few interviews. His aim is to get to the final 2. And then, of course, he will be scrutinised more by the media, by the party members. There'll be 16 different hustings all around the country between the 22nd of June and the middle of July. So, and it's very important that the second one doesn't drop out and allow a coronation, because both of the candidates do need to be tested quite rigorously in that time period.
There's some commentary about his young girlfriend, as she's been described in some of the papers, and whether that will come into the debate as well. Do you think it should? Do you think it will?
You know, if I'm honest, I think that a lot of this media focus over the last few days around, candidates, taking cannabis or snorting cocaine or whatever it is, I wonder, when you look at the sort of things that are moral judgments for the British population, whether we're looking in the wrong place. Because I actually have a much stronger moral judgment about a government that allows 14 million people to live in poverty, 4 million of them children. I have a much stronger moral judgment about a government that allows the level of homelessness that we have. I have a stronger moral judgment about a government that allows austerity cuts to plunge the most disadvantaged people into society, including disabled people, into crisis. I have a really strong moral reaction to that, and I suspect a lot of the British population do as well. So maybe actually, when we look at moral compasses, that should be in the mix.
A lot of people saying they're bored of hearing about the sort of tabloidy stories, even though it's not just in the tabloids, obviously. You mentioned Donald Trump. He's weighed into the election campaign as well. Let's have a listen to him.
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael, but would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
Morality, a much bigger issue in the election of Donald Trump, wasn't it?
He's going to know Michael now.
But he does know Michael.
He doesn't know Michael. He's toying with them,
When he said, I don't know him, that means I don't know him very well? Is that what he was saying there?
He's just going for a headline, isn't he? He's just inserting himself directly in the centre of events.
Are there parallels between his election and potentially Boris's election as well?
Of course there are, because they're both polarising characters. They're both people who shock a lot of what you might call, on this side of the pond, the bien pensant, the polite society, the independently educated, upper-middle-class journalistic commentariat who feel that Boris is the worst side of Britain. But then, Boris, like Trump, has an ability, despite his social standing, despite his privileged lifestyle and upbringing, to drill down into the blue-collar electorate and connect with people. I've seen him at work, as I'm sure we all have. He is genuinely good at understanding what ordinary people are thinking and feeling. And you can snort, But it's true.
I just don't think that's true.
He's certainly,
I really just don't think that's true.
He's certainly
Yeah.
good in relative
It's
terms.
what you'd
Max.
like to think is
no,
true.
it's not true. It's not what I like to think.
Have you ever been
it's
with
not
him?
What
with
I like to think. He is certainly better at understanding what ordinary people are thinking and feeling than the vast majority of my journalistic colleagues in this country.
Have you ever been, Rachel, with him where he's actually been with people, and have you observed him talking to them?
Yeah,
'Cause
I've seen.
Both of us have.
I've seen that he can do that, but that doesn't mean that people will then walk away thinking, "I trust this guy. I trust him to have listened to me."
He won 2 elections as mayor of London
Yeah.
in a Labour voting city. That should tell you something.
He did, and then people discovered what his record was like as mayor.
Well, his record as mayor
and
was
as foreign
okay.
secretary, by the way.
Well, his
which,
record as foreign secretary we can probably agree on.
So there's something about him being able to busk it because of the things that you're talking about. He can engage with people, but he's not being honest. He's not being sincere. And once people see through that, it's too late.
Well, I can only repeat what I just said. There is a major problem in this country, and I feel very much at the heart of it, where our media class and our political class, but particularly our media class, does not understand ordinary people, does not connect with ordinary people, and there are almost no ordinary people among it. And in that sense, the field is wide open for somebody, whether they went to Eton or an Oxford, or if they didn't, to actually reach across and connect with ordinary people. And whether it's very, very good acting or there is some genuine understanding there, and I believe it's a combination of the two, I'll grant you that, Rachel.
Ruler on Facebook says...
then that politician is going to be successful.
We should be focusing on world despots and oligarchs and their massive crimes, and that's from Hong Kong. Human says people still like to see their leaders have morals. Thank you for watching, and you can listen by going to Apple Podcasts, linking up CNN Talk as well.